Welcome to Coffee with Kish. So, welcome to Coffee with Kish. This is Kish, and I'm here to geek out about Mormonism and provide you some insights from my own experience as a Latter-day Saint. Now, I no longer affiliate with the LDS Church by choice, and I have my own reasons, but I still love geeking out about Mormonism. And today I wanted to share with you some of my personal perspectives on what it was like to really be into what I considered the heart of LDS apologetics. The experience of apologetics, the inside of apologetics, is really fascinating. Because when you set out to defend the LDS Church, you learn a lot more about it. You are guaranteed to learn a lot of stuff that you probably just took for granted, going to church on Sunday, reading regular LDS Church literature. You're going to learn new stuff. Now, will that stuff necessarily be helpful for your personal faith? Probably not. Probably not necessarily so. I had a very positive experience at first of LDS apologetics. I didn't even know that that's what I was getting into. I was geeking out on Mormonism, and that started when I first discovered the work of Hugh Nibley. And I still really feel attached to my memory of Hugh Nibley. Not because he was the world's best scholar in every respect. Not because I think he has all the answers, that he's right about everything. When I was in high school, I found this book on my parents' shelf. It was called Since Cumorah. And I started reading this thing, and I fell down the rabbit hole. I thought, this is amazing. This is incredible. I had no idea about this stuff. In Since Cumorah, Hugh Nibley is claiming that there have been all these new discoveries that, in his view, affirmed Mormonism in certain ways. Now, I think there was kind of, you might call it naive fervor about claims of that kind, where people thought, oh my gosh, the Nag Hammadi Library, the Gnostics, the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of these things, they just affirm the LDS Gospel and the revelations of Joseph Smith. And you would see all kinds of also-ran publications by lesser people, all these firesides where people would get up and talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls or publish their pamphlets or books about Gnostics or the Dead Sea Scroll community and really say, Joseph Smith was onto something and this ancient material really shows it. Now, I would say that, in my view anyway, that stuff doesn't really work in the way that you might think it does. But I don't, at the same time, think that it's without value. Now, I was so enthused about these topics that I actually went out and got a PhD in ancient history. Yeah, that's what I did. I haven't shared that before, but I got a PhD in ancient history, which is what Hugh Nibley did. Hugh Nibley went to the University of California at Berkeley, one of the finest institutions in North America, and he got a PhD in ancient history. But he was also a person of his time. And I don't think that his scholarship has necessarily aged well for people. But at the same time, I think it's because he was very limited in his reach and necessarily limited in what he could do. What do I mean by that? Well, he was there really to serve the church. And he was there to defend what he saw as the true gospel, as a person who was obedient to the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he threw his whole life into it. He took his temple covenants really seriously, and in everything he did, I think he was attempting to live his faith to the fullest, use his gifts to that end, and, do a great service to his people. Well, I don't think people really, at large in the LDS Church, ever really understood Hugh Nibley. And honestly, I'm not sure I still do 100%. I have my own view of Hugh Nibley. I don't think I'm necessarily right, but it's the view that I have. It's a very personal experience that I had with Hugh Nibley. It started with reading that book. On my mission, I will admit I broke missionary rules. Big confession here. To read other books by Hugh Nibley. I took some precious money that I was given for my missionary work and bought a first edition copy of Abraham in Egypt, a book that I still own. And I really threw myself into studying Hugh Nibley stuff. It wasn't on the missionary reading list. It wasn't approved. I wasn't supposed to be doing it. All of that's on me, but I was really taken with this stuff. And I would say what he was doing, what I understood him to be doing at the time, was to look at the ancient world through the lens of Joseph Smith's revelations and kind of show that there's a resonance that helps you appreciate the ancient world in a different way, but also shows you that there's some really deep and lasting value in the work that Joseph Smith did. Now, that's my take. I know other people look at it quite differently. I know that in my interactions with LDS apologists, sometimes negative interactions, I've come to appreciate that some of them really do take the methodology of reading the world through the lens of the Restoration. And what I mean by that is the following. Whereas other scholars might take a Marxist view of history, a sociological view of history, all of these modern secular methodologies that they use to analyze the past and understand it, these historians, these apologists, use Joseph Smith's revelations as their lens for understanding ancient history. Now that could be shocking to you. And I think it kind of shocked me when I really finally figured it out. It shouldn't have taken me as long as it did, but maybe I'm kind of slow. But it comes from a place, honestly, of genuine faith and belief that Joseph Smith really did receive these revelations, and that they were of God, and that they were revelatory of the past and what actually happened. And that's a point of view that I kind of walked away from while I was still at BYU, honestly. And it's not that I didn't feel like the gospel was true at the time. I just didn't think that the gospel being true necessarily meant that Joseph Smith's revelations were a clear window to the ancient world. I think that's not a bad way of putting it, actually. I kind of surprised myself on that. Yeah, I didn't really think it was a clear window on the ancient world. In fact, when I went off to my PhD program, I remember talking with a couple in South Provo in my condo, and they're a nice couple, and I told them what I was going to do, that I was going off to this major university to study ancient history, and they looked at me and said, "Oh, that's so wonderful. Now you'll really be able to understand the Book of Mormon well." I shouldn't be laughing, but I was like, What? What are you talking about? I think it's just, it came from a place of not knowing or something what my specific interests in ancient history were. They weren't ancient Mesoamerica. I was a Roman historian, but I guess at the time I also really suddenly thought to myself, I'm not sure that I think the Book of Mormon is an ancient text. And I'm sorry if that offends some of you, but I guess at the time, that's how I felt. I didn't really feel like and I know that must be weird when you hear what a big fan of Hugh Nibley I was. And Hugh Nibley certainly did believe that the Book of Mormon was an ancient text, and he felt like ancient evidence really backed that up. And I do understand why he felt that way. I do. I do understand. And I would say that in my mind, the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith's revelations, at times, you can see them as really genuinely carrying forward a spirit of things that calls back to the past, to the deep past. And I think it's partly just because by their very nature, those revelations place a lot of stock in the past, and they're engaging with it in a very active way. And so when Hugh Nibley does his work, it seems like, yeah, this is exactly right. But I don't really think that that's the same as finding evidence from antiquity that you can connect to its environment in the past. And let me put it this way. In my mind, there's a huge difference between, let's say, the Book of Mormon text, which in a secular way I can only access through its 19th century translation into English, and finding an ancient inscription that an archaeologist has dug up at an archaeological site through careful archaeological practices, scientific archaeology. Now, I'm not asking you to place, the ultimate question of which one is truly ancient on the table here, but if you're a secular historian, you're definitely going to value the inscription that you find through archaeological methods on site over a person who comes up to you and says, "Oh, I translated this ancient text yesterday. Here it is. You should change your view of the ancient world based on what I'm bringing to you in your own language in English that I purport was written by an ancient Babylonian," or something. Just to use it for instance. Obviously, historians are outside of the LDS faith. They're going to treat those things very differently. Well, the apologists would actually, in my mind at least, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, tend to really privilege Joseph Smith's revelation in their apologetic work and say, this is how we should understand antiquity. It's through Joseph Smith's revelatory eyes. And as a matter of faith, I'm not going to argue with that position. That's a personal choice. I went out originally to follow in Hugh Nibley's footsteps, to do the things that he did. And in the course of my travels, in that metaphorically, in my education, I came to quite a different place. And I realized I wanted to do a different thing. I didn't really want to just use my study of the past to affirm LDS positions. Instead, I really fell in love with studying the past in its own right. And honestly, I think that that part of me predated my desire to get into Hugh Nibley. I was always into history. So, I became a Nibleyite. In my undergraduate career at BYU. And why did I do that? It's kind of a personal story, actually, but I would say I did it first because I obviously loved his work to begin with, but I kept feeling the impression that I needed to go study with Hugh Nibley. And I didn't really know how to make that happen. I didn't know what I was doing. So I declared a major in history with a minor in pre med. I quickly discovered that being pre med wasn't me. It didn't really float my boat. Instead, I found that the study of the past was floating my boat. And I switched very quickly to the study of antiquity. You can see how blinkered my thinking process is from one perspective. Why didn't you go to an Ivy League school? Why didn't you, pick a practical major? All of this. Of course, I was completely impractical in every way. I was besotted with Hugh Nibley's writings, and I was just off my mission, so I was really very much in this religious mode and had a lot of fantastic experiences on my mission. I guess I just was looking for a way to almost make that continue. And when I had this particular dream that, seemed to indicate to me that I really needed to go to BYU to study with Hugh Nibley, and I sign up for a course with Hugh Nibley. And I mean, it's gonna sound weird, super Mormon geeky, super LDS geeky especially, but I was on cloud nine. I was having the time of my life. I thought these classes with Nibley were amazing. And it was kind of funny because I would go to these classes and they were like at 8 a.m. In the honors building, and a lot of people would be asleep in these classes, or they would be bored, but I just was completely enthralled by the fire hose of information that was coming out of Hugh Nibley's mouth, because I don't think Hugh Nibley had formal lectures. Hugh Nibley just got up and he just started talking. And if you listened and you had some inkling of what he was talking about, and if you really understood his sense of humor, you were just drinking this stuff and you would be laughing. I was laughing a lot because this dude I thought he was hilarious, very dry sense of humor. And I fell in with this group of people who were hoping to be the next Hugh Nibley. And, we looked up to, in the generation of students before us, we looked up to John Gee. And that John Gee became, when he returned to BYU, the great defender of the Book of Abraham. And I would say, his record in the defense of the Book of Abraham would be considered mixed by both LDS scholars and critics, but he certainly has his ardent supporters. But he was like the model. If you wanted to be like Hugh Nibley, you should model yourself after John Gee. He certainly, the stories, people would tell stories about Nibley interacting with John Gee, where, Nibley would throw out a line of Pindar in Greek, this famous Greek poet who wrote victory odes for athletic winners of Panhellenic Games. Nibley would just roll something out in from Pindar, and then John Gee would finish the line. And we were all just like, wow, being super nerdy. We were just like, wow, that is so awesome. Or let me be a little bit rude here, which is, you're thinking in your mind, man, that is badass. Badass that he would do that. And, I'm still as bad today. I mean, this is what I spent my life doing, right? I still think that is like incredible, because these guys were into the ancient languages, into foreign languages. Nibley was gathering languages like, they were different card games or something. And the stories about his facility with language, like, he finds out that some foreign athlete is coming to town, and someone asks if he could help guide this guy around. So Nibley spends the next few days like learning the guy's language so he can communicate with him. Now, on the one hand, that may not be as difficult as you think to learn very basic communication in a few days, especially if, you spend your time learning languages. And that's in the humanities, the scholars, that's, what a number of people do, especially if you're working on, you know, cultural studies in a foreign land. You'll learn those languages, and you'll have to learn, multiple dialects or a bunch of different languages in the region, and that just goes with the territory. But no, he really was amazing at this stuff. There's no question about it, and I fell into that world, and I took classes with Nibley, and I had a blast. It was I looked at it as my future. It was my track. And I think, in a way, I haven't left that behind. Not because I have any real investment in defending the LDS Church, but I really fell in love with the study of antiquity, and Hugh Nibley was kind of the gateway drug for me to fall into that world. But I think it's, also just an interest in the modern history of the study of the past, and where did Hugh Nibley get his ideas, and why did he choose the positions that he chose? Because of course Hugh Nibley wasn't in the good graces or in agreement with lots of Latter-day Saints of his time, and he was very much into liberal political points of view, for example. And I would say I was interested, or introduced rather, to that kind of thinking because I read Hugh Nibley's rather more liberal takes on LDS doctrine, liberal takes on economics, LDS economics, the law of consecration, what Zion is. You could say that there's some sort of populist aspect to it, maybe. Got to be careful there. I don't want to push that too far because I don't think Nibley was really a populist. In some ways, Nibley, you could consider him an elitist. And to this day, I don't really quite understand his affection for Brigham Young. I'm one of those horrible people who's not a big fan of Brigham Young. Hugh Nibley was, very much so, and wrote articles and books defending Brigham Young. That, be that as it may, as I say, but to this day I still have a lot of affection for Hugh Nibley, for my experience studying with him, and that memory of being with the Nibleyites, one of those students who really wanted to emulate Hugh Nibley. Now, there were a bunch of us, and most of them were taking ancient Near Eastern studies, but that they would also, some of them would double major in classics, and they wanted to learn Hebrew and Greek and maybe some Latin, but mostly Hebrew and Greek and maybe Syriac, a form of Aramaic. Some of them, of course, like John Gee, aspired to be Egyptologists, and so they were already studying Egyptology. I took a class with S. Kent Brown in Coptic. And the funny story about me taking Coptic. So Coptic is like the last form of ancient Egyptian, and it's almost like a medieval form of ancient Egyptian. It's really late. It uses an alphabet that's a mishmash of Demotic Greek characters with a Greek alphabet loan letters. And I took this class partly because I was fascinated by the Book of Abraham, right? And I thought, well, being interesting to learn some Egyptian. But also I was afraid to take Greek because to me it was like, ooh, Greek is so exotic and hard, and I'm taking Latin now, but how could I ever take Greek? So I reasoned falsely that I should take Coptic because at least I would learn some Greek alphabet and learn some Greek words because Coptic contains both. And in some ways, Coptic, not grammatically speaking, but in terms of its vocabulary, is much, much harder than Greek because you don't have any, Indo-European word roots to work with. It's not like, pater and father, or, like you have with Greek and Latin. You have plenty of similarity in the languages on a linguistic level that you can almost kind of fake it, honestly. And I remember sitting around with Stephen Ricks, Professor Ricks, who was another guy who wrote for Farms, and he tried to teach me how to sort of fake it with Indo-European languages that you didn't know by just paying attention to the word roots, and that was an experience that I really still value to this day. But there I was in Coptic, and I was there with other people that I was really starting to see a lot in other classes and see in what was the sanctum sanctorum for the Nibley Acolytes, which was the Ancient Studies Library in the Harold B. Lee Library. Okay, so the Ancient Studies Library was kind of like a special collections library, but it was just for books about the ancient world, and you had to get a special access code to get into this room, and once you were in there, you had access to all of these materials that weren't circulating in the main library. And this room, oh, hopeful Nibleyite who wants to be next to their, the master himself, it was directly attached to Hugh Nibley's office. So sometimes you would see Hugh Nibley come into the Ancient Studies Library, and you would catch a glimpse of him, and then you'd get these poor, unfortunate souls who would start bothering him as he was trying to work. And seriously, sometimes it made me upset on his behalf. He's sitting there in the Ancient Studies Library trying to get something done, and people would walk in and disturb him, and he would realize, I can't even be safe in this space. But on a couple of occasions, I actually went up to him to ask him a question. I think I asked him about the Adam God theory, and he gave me a very cryptic and mysterious answer that really had, frankly, a lot to do with Kabbalah or Kabbalah. At the time, I didn't know, but I remembered his answer, and I asked people years later what he meant, and they explained what his cryptic answer that was an answer from Kabbalah was about. So, you really did feel like you're in the realm of the mysteries there with Professor Nibley. So I got into graduate school and studied really hard, and kept tabs on the Nibley world, and would go back to Utah to start my pilgrimages, meet up with other Niblites on occasion. That's what I'm going to call them. And then Martha Nibley Beck's book came out, and I read it. And at first I was really kind of horrified, I don't doubt her sincerity. But at the end of the day, I just didn't really think that Hugh Nibley had done that stuff. But I did wonder whether the now abandoned practice of couples having practicing actually the true order of prayer in their own homes did not figure into her accusations. Now, there are certain rituals that take place in the temple that back in the 70s and before the 1970s, members of the church were able to perform at home. They could put on their temple garb and have an altar and engage in what's called the true order of prayer in their own homes. And I'm not really going to get into the details. It's sacred. I almost feel like inhibited talking about it at all. But when Martha Nibley Beck talks about her father, dressing up in an unusual costume with an altar, et cetera, I just go, I mean, at first I didn't have a box to put it in because by the time I went to the temple myself and got my own endowment and so forth, this was a practice that had been gone for over 10 years. So I never participated in, nor did I see my parents do it ever. But it was something that happened, and it involved elements of the temple being performed outside the temple, but with the blessing of the church itself. It was authorized, and I can't but think that a man like Professor Nibley, who loved the temple so much, that he took advantage of that opportunity. He was big into the true order of prayer in the temple, the altars in the temple. This was all part of what he was deeply, deeply passionate about in his studies. And so I think he probably did those things. Now, members of the family can correct me and say, you're completely wrong. That never happened. You shouldn't speculate about this stuff. But that's really how I've come to think of what might have happened here in Martha Nibley Beck's recollection of her childhood. Now that I have walked away from affiliation with the LDS Church, I still think fondly of those times and my experiences with Dr. Nibley. Not all of them were good. I remember one time I was trying to be helpful to Dr. Nibley. He was out in the parking lot where the faculty parked on campus, and he had lost his vehicle. He drove this little brown Opel. It looked almost like a tiny Honda Civic, but even, more modest vehicle. So I started to interact with him about, I could see he couldn't find his vehicle. So I said, Dr. Nibley, can you tell me what your vehicle looks like? And he looked at me really cross. He says, well, I know what it looks like. And I said, oh, I guess I'll just leave him alone. Here's a guy that so many people pester, and he's a human being. There's another episode with him that I'll never forget, and that is they had this big event. And I think we were taking Coptic at the time from S. Kent Brown. But there was this big event where there was going to be a passing of the torch from Professor Nibley to Wilford Griggs, Dr. Wilford Griggs, who works on, late Christian Egypt, before the Muslim conquest. He's done some archaeology there, written about Egyptian Christianity. I've got a book that he wrote on Egyptian Christianity. So this was a big deal, right? And in a way, it was kind of scary if you're a fan of Nibley, because you can't get enough of Nibley. You just want him to continue to do what he's doing. But it was kind of a passing of the torch. Well, Nibley gets up to give this talk, and he's talking about the temple. And I think this is a great story for our current moment of time in the history of LDS temple worship. Well, I was there, other Niblites were there, lots of other people were there, and he starts giving this talk about the temple and apostasy. And he starts saying things like, if the saints can't handle the truths that they're given, then God's going to take them away. And I'm sitting there, I'm going, is that guy saying what I think he's saying? Because one of the most really trying experiences, I don't know one of the biggest shake-ups in my life of faith was the fact that I went through one version of the endowment before my mission and in the MTC, and then I leave my mission to a completely different version of the endowment that's changed in really noticeable ways. And I had a hard time processing that. But sitting there listening to Nibley, I was like, oh, is that what's going on here? Was the temple endowment changed because Latter-day Saints really just couldn't handle what they'd been given, and so they're given less truth? Of course, a lot of you guys are going to say, well, that's a bunch of hogwash because, you don't like the temple, you think it's weird, and you thought, well, it was probably better without that weird stuff. But for me, the temple had been a very profound spiritual experience my first time through, and it's not like it ceased to be, but I had a hard time understanding why did it change. And Hugh Nibley was giving me an answer, and he didn't come right out and say it. So you see, what Nibley would do, and I think he was kind of a master at this, is he could communicate a message without coming out and just directly saying what it was that he meant. If you paid attention and you understood what he was talking about, well, you got the message. And some of the things that he said were almost kind of oppositional to the status quo, certainly. And whereas, a lot of people might say that no matter how the temple changes or other things in the church change, it's always an improvement. Everything's always getting better. It's always in a refinement. It's always a refinement, and the ongoing restoration is happening, and it's becoming more and more perfect all the time. And I think that's more along the lines of the message today. That wasn't Hugh Nibley's message. It was definitely not Hugh Nibley's message on that day. His message was, yes, the endowment's changed. No, I don't think that it was anything to celebrate. We knew, based on his work on antiquity, that he saw value in some of the things that had been taken out of the endowment. We knew that he valued some things that were taken out, and the only way that he could really make sense out of this was through the lens of apostasy. So I can tell you that I walk out of that talk and my mind is blown, seriously blown. And all of my fellow Nibleyites, they were looking at me going, can you believe what this guy said? Can you believe what Professor Nibley just said? And I think I felt affirmed at that moment. It's one of those times when you really feel like you've got a community and that you're all on the same wavelength. And that was cool. I mean, how you feel about the temple and whether it's a good or bad thing for it to change. Maybe it's just what the will of God is from your perspective or whatever. But I know in that moment, as a Nibleyite, I felt more part of that Nibley crew than ever before, because we had all watched the master Hugh Nibley share this message, and we got it. We could tell that a lot of people didn't get it, but we definitely got it. And to this day, I think it was kind of a remarkable experience. But that was Hugh Nibley. He was the kind of guy who would say things that caught people off guard, that they didn't necessarily understand, but were really rooted in a worthwhile observation. I remember there was a story about him getting up at commencement at BYU to say a prayer, and he started talking about how everyone was gathered in the robes of the false priesthood. And what he was talking about, of course, was academic robes, because from his point of view, real education started at the temple. And so temple robes were the real robes of the real priesthood, whereas academic robes are just kind of like a phony ersatz replacement. So that's the story that I have today. Little bit of a history of my entrance into the world of apologetics through my contact with Hugh Nibley at BYU. I ended up taking 2 courses with him. Saw him speak a couple of times outside of that context. Spoke to him personally a few times. I have other more positive occasions than the one where he got mad at me for trying to help him find his car. He was probably just in a bad mood. And also, I think one of the important things I took away from all of that experience was the friends that I made, the good interactions I had with people, and I still feel a very strong sense of kinship with people who were admirers of Hugh Nibley and who went down that road, the same road that I went down. And obviously, that road led me to a different destination than some others found, but there are also those I think I have probably at least my own sense of closeness to, like the backyard professor, who was also a big fan of Nibley's work and really went down that rabbit hole, and I think is, again, still someone who's a seeker, searcher, someone who's investigating, who's open-minded, and still looking into those questions about ancient texts and religions. And so I feel a real strong simpatico with him. I like watching a lot of the stuff that he does. And I just feel like he gets where I'm coming from, and I feel like I get where he's coming from in a way that maybe other people don't, because of that common background of Hugh Nibley following and pursuing that interest in the ancient world, in ancient religions and texts, sacred texts. So that's one of the reasons why I'm still a huge fan of the Backyard Professor. Well, it's time to call an end to this Coffee with Kish. I'm Kish. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. It makes a big difference to me to know that you guys are out there watching, listening to what I have to say, and finding some value in my perspective. Take care.